He did not follow the child out of kindness. He followed her because the tin she carried had been leaving his house every Thursday for 11 months, and Marek Volney had never once been told what was inside it. 2 days before a marriage that would fold two families into one, his housekeeper looked him in the face and told him a lie, and in his world, one lie is the first stone of an avalanche. So he waited in the rain across from a boarded church on Kilbourne Row and watched a girl of 7 push open a door that should have been chained shut. What he heard through that door did not simply change his mind about the wedding. It put him on his knees in the mud. The studio smelled of linseed oil and cold ash, and Marek had been standing in the same place for 1 hour and 40 minutes. The painter had built him a little island out of a folded rug and a wooden crate, and on that island he was required to remain, right hand resting on the back of a chair, chin lifted, weight on the left leg. Every so often, the man made a small sound behind the canvas, a click of the tongue, and adjusted something Marek could not see. The north window let in a flat gray light that made the whole room look like the inside of an oyster shell. His shoulder ached. The harness under his jacket had been cut by a tailor in Ver Street, who understood that certain men do not undress for portraits, and the leather sat where it always sat, snug beneath the arm, a familiar, dull pressure against the ribs. He had been asked once to remove it. He had looked at the painter, and the painter had not asked again. "You have gone stiff," Solene said from the settee. "You look like a man waiting to be sentenced." She was not looking at him. She was holding a swatch card up against the window light, 3 shades of ivory fanned between her fingers, turning them slowly the way a jeweler turns a stone. Sullen Barrow was 32 years old, and had the particular polish of a woman who had never in her life been rained on by accident. Her hair was the color of wet sand and pinned so precisely that it looked less like hair than like something forged. "I am standing exactly as he asked," Marek said. "You are standing like furniture." She set one swatch aside. "The frame will be gilded. Not gold, gilded. There is a difference. And my mother will notice the difference within 4 seconds of entering the room. So the drapery behind you cannot be warm. If the drapery is warm, the whole thing turns yellow, and we look like a family of butter merchants. Then make it cold." "I am making it cold. I am asking whether you have an opinion." "I do not." "No," she agreed pleasantly. "You never do." She said it without malice, which was the thing about Selene. There was no cruelty in her, and no warmth, either. She was a clause. Her father had ports on the Northern Reach, and Marek had the freight yards and a customs men, and somebody in a paneled room had decided that the cleanest way to join those two facts was a wedding. And so there would be a wedding, and there would be a portrait of the wedding. And the portrait would hang in a hall where neither of them would ever sit alone. He understood the arrangement. He had agreed to it with the same part of himself that approved shipping manifests. It was efficient. It would end a great deal of bloodshed that would otherwise happen over 18 months and 200 men. He did not resent her for a single hour of it. He simply could not remember, standing there in the oyster light, the last time he had wanted anything. "Chin?" the painter said. Marek lifted his chin. The clock on the studio mantel was a hideous thing, brass and glass, with the works exposed so you could watch the escapement rock back and forth. He watched it. 2:20. At 2:20 on a Thursday, the house on Arden Hill would be exactly halfway through its afternoon, the downstairs shutters half drawn against the west sun, the kettle going in the back kitchen, and Anik would be crossing the courtyard with the day's post and the ledger of household accounts under her arm, ready to catch him for the 10 minutes he gave her every Thursday, except that she had not caught him last Thursday, or the one before. "You have gone stiff again," Selene said. "Sorry." "Do not be sorry. Be still." She put down the swatches. "Marek, the rehearsal is tomorrow evening at 7. Your uncle wants to speak before it about the seating, because apparently the Hallvard cousins cannot be within sight of one another without one of them saying something about a boat. I have told him he may have 4 minutes. Conrad wants 4 minutes about a boat. Conrad wants 4 minutes about anything. He is the sort of man who needs to be handed a small responsibility every few days, or he starts inventing them. She smoothed her skirt. He has been very attentive lately. You should be pleased. Most families would kill for an uncle who returns a telephone call. The painter made his clicking sound. Marek held the chair back and looked at the flat gray window and felt the beginning of a headache pressing up behind his left eye. Something moved in the courtyard below. It was nothing. It was a girl in a yellow coat crossing the cobbles of the studio yard toward the gate, because the studio yard was the shortest way from Arden Hill down to the tram, and she was 7 years old and small for it, and she walked the way children walk when they have been told 100 times not to run. In her right hand, held out slightly from her body to keep it level, was a blue enamel tin about the size of a bread loaf. Marek watched her until the gate swallowed her. The tin was the strange part. Not the girl, not the coat, not the hour. The tin. It was old. Older than the child by a long way, the blue gone chalky at the corners, and one dent in the lid shaped like the heel of a hand. He had a feeling about that tin that he could not put anywhere. It was the feeling you get in a stranger's house when you notice a smell you know and cannot name, and the naming of it sits just behind your teeth for the rest of the evening and never quite arrives. Then he looked at the clock again. 23 minutes past 2, 11 months. Every Thursday, for 11 months, that tin had gone out of his house at 20 past 2, and it had never once come back in. Aunt Pharaoh had been in his household for 4 years and 1 month, and in that time Marek had never had to think about a single thing that happened between the front door and the back stair. This was not a small achievement. His was not a normal house. There were 9 men on the property at any hour, and a 10th on the gate, and they were not the sort of men who wiped their boots. They came in at 4 in the morning smelling of the river. They tracked things across floors that a woman with any sense would have wept over. They put their weapons down on side tables, and side tables in that house had a way of being wiped clean and left exactly as they were, weapon and all. Because Annie had decided early that it was not her business to move a man's property, and it was very much her business that there be no ring of oil on the walnut. She knew which of them had a wife, and which had only said so. She knew that Emer could not eat anything with cream in it and would rather choke politely than say so at a table. She knew that the north cellar flooded when the tide came high and the rain came together, and she had known it 8 months before the surveyor did, because she had gone down with a candle and a piece of chalk and marked the waterline herself on 4 separate nights. She kept the accounts in a hand so small and even that the bank clerk who came up twice a year to reconcile them had once asked, without meaning to be rude, whether the household employed a professional. She bought the coffee herself rather than have it delivered, because the delivery man had a brother on the Halvard side, and she had worked that out on her own without telling anyone, and had simply changed the arrangement and let the invoice explain it. When the roof lost Lates in the February gale, she had the repair quoted by 3 separate firms, and then had it done by a man she found in the parish who had been a shipwright, on the grounds that a shipwright understands water, and the roof had not leaked since. She had never once, in all that time, asked Marek a question about his business. That was the thing that had made her indispensable. Everyone else in his life asked. His men asked with their eyes. His lawyers asked with their long, careful sentences. Conrad asked outright, over dinner, with his hand around a glass. Anka came into the room with a tray, and set it down and left, and if there were 3 men in that room discussing what to do about a 4th, she would still set the tray down in the middle of the sentence and go out again and shut the door softly behind her, and the sentence would resume, and it would never occur to any of them to lower their voices. Because after the first year, they had all simply stopped seeing her as a person who could hear. Marek had seen her frightened exactly once, and it had not been the time he expected. 2 winters ago, 4 men from the Halvard side had come up the hill at night with a grievance and a great deal of drink in them, and they had got as far as the kitchen passage before Emmerich put them on the floor. There had been shouting. There had been a chair broken, and Annika had come down the back stair in a dressing gown with her hair in a plait, stepped over a man who was sitting on her tiles with a cut lip, looked at the mess of it with an expression of mild professional irritation, and asked Emmerich whether he intended to leave them there, because if so, she would put newspaper down. Not one flinch. Not one. But he had come into the back kitchen unannounced one evening, the following spring, and found her at the table with the household ledger open, and she had shut it, not hurried. Not guilty. She had simply closed the book with one hand and put the other flat on the cover, and looked up at him, with a face so entirely empty that he had felt, for a strange half-second, as though he were the one intruding on his own house. He had asked her if the accounts were in order. She had said they were, and that the fishmonger had raised his price for the second time that year, and did Marek want her to find another, or accept it? He had said, accept it, and he had gone out, and he had thought about the sound of that book closing perhaps 4 times in the 18 months since. She had a daughter. He knew that the way he knew the name of his gardener's dog, which is to say, he had been told it once and had filed it somewhere behind everything that mattered. The girl lived in the 2 rooms above the old carriage house, went to the parish school on Lourdes Street, and had on perhaps a dozen occasions been visible at the far end of a corridor, disappearing because Ante had trained her to disappear. Audie, that was the name. Audie, short for something, longer that Marek had never asked about. He had passed her on the back stair in October. She had flattened herself against the wall to let him by, the way you would for a horse, and she had said, "Good afternoon, Mr. Volney," in a small, clear voice, and he had said good afternoon, and had gone on up, and he had not thought about it again. That was the whole of what he knew. 50 months of her under his roof, and a woman he could not have described the eye color of, and then, 11 months ago, a blue tin had started leaving his house on Thursdays. And 9 days ago Auntie had lied to him. He had asked her, in passing, in the corridor, with his coat half on, whether the girl was ill because he had noticed she had not been at the parish school on the Tuesday. And Annika had said, without a pause, without a blink, that Audie had been at school all week. Marek had watched her mouth make the sentence. He had thanked her, he had gone out to the car. And he had sat in the back of it for a full minute before telling Emmerich to drive. Because in all the years she had worked for him, the woman had never given him a single word that was not dull and exact and true, and he had just watched her hand him a false one as smoothly as she handed him his coffee. "We are done," Marek said. The painter looked up from behind the canvas with the expression of a man who has been told the tide is going out early. "Signor, the light will not be this way again until Tuesday. Then we will do it Tuesday." Marek stepped down off the crate. The blood came back into his left leg in a hot rush of pins. He took his coat from the hook by the stove and put it on, and the weight of it settled the harness properly against his side. Selene had risen. She did not raise her voice, because she never did. She had a way of getting quieter as she got angrier, so that by the end of a disagreement, you found yourself leaning toward her. "The sitting is 3 hours," she said. "You have given him 1 hour and 50 minutes. There are 2 sittings before Saturday, and then there are no more sittings. Because after Saturday I imagine you will find it very difficult to stand still in a room with me at all." "Something has come up, something has come up," she repeated. "Marek, in 9 weeks I have watched you cancel 4 things. Every one of them has been something of mine." He paused at the door with his hand on the frame. That landed. It landed because it was accurate, and he had a great and inconvenient respect for accuracy. "That is fair," he said. "I am not asking you to love me. I would find it embarrassing." She folded her arms. "I am asking you to be visible. On Saturday, there will be 160 people in a room, and every single one of them will be counting how many times you look at your watch. That is the whole of the transaction. You knew that when you agreed to it, I know." "So what has come up?" Marek considered lying. It would have been easy, and she would have accepted it, and they would both have gone on with their afternoon. My housekeeper lied to me, he said. Solon's expression did not change so much as it simplified. Your housekeeper. Yes, you are walking out of your own engagement portrait because a woman who irons your shirts told you a fib about a fishmonger. Not about a fishmonger? I do not care what it was about. She let out a breath through her nose. Marek, replace her. Truly, this is not a difficult problem. My mother goes through 3 a year and has never once had to think about it. You telephone an agency on Bell Row, you say the last one was dishonest, and on Monday a new one arrives who irons better. She has been in my house 4 years. Then she has had 4 years of good fortune. She has keys, Marek said, to every room on the ground floor and both cellars. She has the household ledger and the cash book, which between them show every man I have paid out of my own hand since my father died. She lets the doctor in at 3 in the morning and she has never once asked why. She has stood in the room while I have said things that would put me under the prison. He pulled his gloves from his pocket. You do not fire that woman. You find out what she is doing, and then you decide. Selena was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice had gone flat and businesslike, and Marek understood that he was being taken seriously for the first time all afternoon. Then send Emmerich, she said. That is what he is for. No, why not? Because if Anik Farah was selling him, Marek wanted to be the one standing there when he found out. Not because he wanted to hurt her. He did not think, standing in that cold studio, that he would be able to hurt her, and that fact was itself a problem large enough to require his personal attention. And because a small, unhelpful voice at the back of his skull had been saying, since the corridor 9 days ago, that a woman who had told him the truth for 4 years does not begin lying about her own child unless the truth has become something she cannot afford to say out loud. Because I want to see it myself, he said. He went down the studio stairs, 2 at a time. Emmerich was in the yard with the engine already running, because Emmerich had heard boots on the stair and had never in 6 years guessed wrong about what they meant. Ardennes Hill, Emmerich said. No. Merrick got into the front, which he never did, and Emmerich had the sense not to remark on it. Kilbourne Row, down by the old tram terminus, park, where we can see the church and turn the engine off. Emmerich's hand stilled on the wheel for a moment. Kilbourne is nothing, boss. There is nothing down there. It has been nothing since the fire. I know what is down there. The car pulled out through the gate and into the grey, and the first rain of the afternoon came down and spread itself across the glass, and Marek Volney sat with his hands loose in his lap and prepared himself, quite calmly, to catch a thief. The city changed by degrees, the way a man goes grey. They came down off Ardennes Hill, through the good streets first, where the plane trees were polleted into neat fists, and the railings were painted every second spring, and every door had a brass plate on it, announcing a solicitor, or a dealer in coins. Then the tram lines began, and with the tram lines came the shops that sold 2 of a thing, rather than 40, and then the shops that sold whatever had come in that week. The buildings lost their front gardens. Then they lost their steps. Then they lost their upper floors to 100 years of subsidence, and stood leaning gently against one another, all down the row, like drunks, agreeing about something. By the time they crossed the iron bridge at Salter Wharf, the rain had settled into the steady, vertical business it did in that city between October and March, and the gutters were running brown, and the light had gone the color of dishwater at 4 in the afternoon. Marek had not been down here in 4 years. He kept his eyes on the wet road and did the arithmetic that men in his position do instead of feeling things. He paid Aniki Farrow £11 a week, which was very nearly double what the Barrow House paid theirs, and on top of that, she had the 2 rooms above the carriage house rent-free, and the coal, and whatever came out of the kitchen. He had approved the figure himself the year she came. He had approved it because his mother's old cook had told him, in the last month of her life, that if you pay a housekeeper properly, You never have to count the spoons. So, the woman had money. She had more money than anyone in her position had a right to, and her daughter went out every Thursday afternoon with a tin on a tram into the worst quarter of the city, and came home without it. There were only so many things that fitted. He turned each of them over with the flat professional patience of a man sorting nails. A courier. That was the ugly one, and the likeliest. You use a child because nobody stops a child. Nobody searches a child. A child walks out through the gate of a guarded house with a tin in her hand, and the man on the gate says, "Hello, sweetheart," and thinks nothing of it for 11 months. Whatever was in that tin, film or paper or cash, or a copy of the household ledger, folded down to the size of a playing card, it had been going out of his house 50 times over, and he had watched it go himself from a studio window and thought about drapery. The other possibility was that Anneke was being squeezed. Somebody had something on her and was bleeding her weekly, and she had chosen to pay rather than to come to him, which would have been stupid because Marek Volney was extremely good at the specific problem of people who squeeze other people, and she, of all people, knew it. He did not like how much he preferred the second explanation. That was the part that had been sitting wrong with him since the corridor. Not the lie. The lie was a fact, and facts were manageable. What was wrong was that some part of him had already started building a case for her defense, before he had heard a single word of evidence. And Marek did not do that. He had not done it for men he had known 20 years. He made himself go back over it properly. There had been a Thursday in the summer, a hot one, when he had come into the back kitchen for water, and found Anneke at the range with her sleeves pushed up cooking. Not the household dinner. The household dinner was made by Mrs. Lasker and eaten at 6. So, this was something else. A pot of it, a great deal of it, and she had been portioning it into that same blue tin, with a ladle, and when he came in, she had not startled, she had simply gone on ladling and said good evening, and asked whether he wanted lemon in the water. He had said, no lemon. He had taken his glass and gone out. 4 seconds, maybe 5, and he had filed the whole thing under nothing at all, because a housekeeper standing over a stove is the least remarkable image the human mind can produce. It had taken him until this afternoon, sitting in a cold car in the rain, to hear the other half of it. She had been sweating. In a hot kitchen in July, a woman cooks and sweats, and it means nothing. But she had been cooking after the household had already eaten out of her own hours, and Mrs. Lasker had gone home at 5, and there had been a half sack of dried beans open by her foot, and Marek had walked past all of it and asked for water. "Dare," Emmerich said. The girl was on the near side of the road, 40 yards ahead, coming out of the tram shelter with the tin held out level in front of her. Marek sat forward. "Do not slow down," he said. "Go past her. Turn at the church and come back up the other way and park behind the coal office." Marek did it smoothly, at the same speed, and Marek watched the yellow coat pass the wing of the car and slide away behind them, and had a strange lurch under his ribs at how small she was against the wet gray length of that street. There was a second thing he saw, and he almost did not register it because he was looking at the child. A man in a flat cap was standing in the recessed doorway of a shuttered chandler's shop, across from the tram stop. He was not sheltering. If you are sheltering from rain, you stand with your back to the weather and your shoulders up, and you look at nothing, and you shift your feet. This man was standing square, with his hands at his sides, and his head turned to follow the girl, and when she had gone by, he stepped out into the rain and walked in the opposite direction, unhurried, toward the public telephone box on the corner by the bridge. Marek watched him in the wing mirror until the mirror lost him. "Marek, I saw him. Do you know him?" "No." A pause. "But he stands like ours." The car came to rest behind the coal office, with the engine off and the rain drumming on the roof, and Marek did not move for a moment because the arithmetic had just changed shape and he did not yet know into what. Then he looked up the street and understood the other thing. She was walking the wrong way. The parish school on Lord Street was north and east, back across the bridge, 20 minutes on the tram. She had just got off 2 stops early. There was nothing south of the tram terminus. There had not been anything south of the tram terminus since the fire. There were no shops down there, no houses that anyone lived in, no reason on the face of the earth for a 7-year-old girl to walk into it in the rain, and she was not hesitating. She was not looking at street names or checking a piece of paper. She went down Kilbourne Row at the steady, unhurried pace of a child who has walked a route so many times that her feet know it better than she does, and she turned left at the burnt end of the terrace without breaking stride. Merrick got out of the car. "Boss, stay with it. Boss, if the man in the cap comes back, then he comes back, and you sit there and let him." Merrick turned his collar up. "If I am not out in half an hour, you still sit there. Do you understand me? You do not come in." Emmerich did not like it. Emmerich had a face like a closed door, and it did not open for much. But Merrick could see him not liking it. "Half an hour," Emmerich said. The rain took him immediately and thoroughly. The way rain does, when you have spent your life getting in and out of cars. He went down Kilbourne Row on the opposite pavement, 40 yards back, with his hands in his pockets and his head down, and he made himself walk at the pace of a man with nowhere to be. Nobody saw him. That was the strangest part. On any street in that city, at 4 in the afternoon, there is somebody, a woman with a pram, a man mending a bicycle, boys. Here there was nothing but the rain hitting the road and the sound of his own soles, and, ahead of him, the small wet slap of the child's shoes. The terrace on both sides was dead. Windows boarded, doors nailed with cross battens, and above the second story, the bricks still black and long tongues where the flames had gone up out of the openings and licked their way over the sills. Somebody had painted numbers on the boards in white, and the numbers had run in the weather and dripped and dried again, so the whole street was written over with pale gray tears. He had known this street would look like this. He had signed things about it. There had been a file, and in the file there had been photographs, and Marek had looked at the photographs, the way you look at photographs, of a place, and had turned the page. It is one thing to turn a page. It is another thing entirely to walk down the page in the rain and hear how quiet it is. At the bottom of the row the church stood on its own island of broken paving. "St. Ansgar," it said, on the lintel, in letters cut so deep that not even the fire had got all the way into them. The roof was gone at the east end and had been patched with sheeting weighted down by cinder blocks. Every window on the street side was boarded. There was a chain on the main doors, with a padlock the size of a fist, and the padlock was rusted into a solid orange lump, and the chain went nowhere near the small door in the north porch. The girl went to the small door. She did not knock. She put her shoulder against it, low down, and shoved twice, and the door gave inward with a scrape of swollen wood on stone, and she went through sideways, holding the tin in front of her with both hands now, and it shut behind her. Merrick stood in the road in the rain and looked at that door for a long moment. Every instinct he had built over 20 years told him to go back to the car, put 4 men on this address, and know everything about it by 9 o'clock that evening, without ever having set his own foot on the paving. That was how it was done. That was why he had men. A man in his position who walks alone into a boarded building in a burnt street is not brave. He is careless, and careless men have short careers and long funerals. He went across the road anyway. He was halfway over when the porch door scraped again. Marek did not run, because running is what gets a man seen. He took 2 long steps sideways into the shadow of the buttress at the corner of the church and put his back flat against the stone and stopped breathing, and he stood there in the rain, with his heart going like a hammer, while somebody came out into the porch, not 9 feet from him. It was the boy with the crutch. He came out, swinging the leg stiffly, and dragged the door most of the way shut behind him, and he went to the corner of the porch and looked up and down Kilbourne Row, left first, and then right. Slowly. It was not a boy looking at the weather. It was a boy doing a job he had been given and did every week, and doing it properly. Marek stood 4 feet from him, behind 18 inches of stone, and understood that these people posted a watch. Then the boy went back in, and the door scraped shut, and Marek let his breath out through his teeth and found that his shirt was stuck to his back, and that it had nothing to do with the rain, not to the porch door. There was a lower window on the north side where the boarding had been cut and reset as a shutter. And behind the shutter the glass was gone, and there was a gap along the bottom edge where the wood had warped. Marek crouched. The paving was slick with moss, and there was an inch of standing water in the gutter that went straight into his shoe and up his sock, cold as a coin. He put his eye to the gap. The first thing was the smell. It came out of that gap, warm and thick, and it was not the smell of a ruin. It was smoke, but wood smoke, clean. The smell of a stove with a decent draw, wet wool drying, carbolic soap, and underneath all of it, very faint, boiled onions. The second thing was the light. There was firelight down at the far end where the chancel would have been, and around it, somebody had built a room inside the room. Walls made of stacked pews on their sides and hung with tarpaulin and blankets, so that the great cold shell of the church stayed a great cold shell, and the only warm part of it was one small square in the corner, roofed over with corrugated sheet, glowing at the seams like something alive. The third thing was the people. Marek counted 11. 11. In a building that everyone in the city, himself included, had understood to be empty since the year it burned. There was an old woman sitting nearest the stove in a chair that had come out of somebody's parlor, and she had a shawl over her head and her hands folded, and she did not move much. There were 2 men playing a game with bottle tops on an upturned crate, and one of them had a face that was not a face on the left side, the ear gone entirely, the skin drawn up smooth and shining toward the jaw, the way skin goes when it has been through fire and healed as best it could. There was a younger woman with a baby on her hip and a burn scar up the whole of her right forearm. There was a man of about 60 sitting perfectly still and facing slightly to one side of the room, in the particular way of a man who is listening rather than looking, and his eyes, when the firelight caught them, were the flat, pale gray of old milk. There was a boy of maybe 10, with a crutch under one arm. And there was Audie in her yellow coat, standing in the middle of them with the blue tin held out in both hands, being greeted the way a person is greeted who is expected and wanted and slightly late. Marek Volney knelt in the wet at the foot of the wall of a burnt church, and found that his hands had begun to shake and would not stop. "You are wet through," the old woman said. "Come to the stove, child, before you catch something, and your mother has my hide. I am not wet through. I am only wet on top." Audie put the tin down on the crate, which caused an immediate small argument between the 2 bottle-top men about the state of the game, which she ignored entirely. "It is beans again. I am sorry it is beans again. Mama says beans, 4 weeks running, is a failure of imagination. But the butcher put his price up on Tuesday, and she said, 'We are not paying it out of principle.'" "Out of principle," said the man with half a face, in a voice of pure delight. "Hear that, Tolliver Principle?" "I heard it," said the blind man. "Your mother is the last woman in this city with any." Audie was undoing the clasps on the tin. She did it carefully, one and then the other, and she had to press with both thumbs on the second one because it was stiff, and Marek watched her small hands work at it and felt something behind his sternum turn over like a body in sleep. "There is bread as well," she said. "It is yesterday's bread, but Mama says yesterday's bread is better for you because you have to chew it, and chewing is good for the teeth. That is not true. She says things like that when she does not want you to be sad about the bread." "Very sensible," said the old woman. "And there is a jar of the pears from the big house. Only 1 jar. I have to bring the jar back or it gets noticed." She frowned at the tin. "The jars get noticed. The food does not get noticed because Mama does the ordering, and she orders for 11 extra people every week, and nobody has ever asked her why the house eats so much. She says the trick is to be the person who counts the things. And then nobody counts them twice. The woman with the baby laughed low and shifted the child to her other hip. They ate. That was the part Merrick had not been ready for. He had been braced for something to be handed over, something furtive, a package or an envelope, and instead, there was the plain domestic business of 11 people getting a share of a pot of beans out of a tin, carried down on a tram by a child, and it was done with plates, actual plates, mismatched and chipped, and the boy with the crutch handed them round. And nobody started until everyone had one. The old woman said, "Audie, you will do it. I always do it. You do it best." The child wiped her hands on the front of her coat and put them together, and every head in that firelit corner went down, and the two bottle-top men stopped their argument mid-word. Marek could not have moved if the roof had come in. "Thank you for this food," Audie said, in the flat, rapid sing-song of a child, performing something she has performed 100 times and means anyway. "Thank you for the stove, and the dry corner, and thank you that Ivar's leg is better. Thank you for Mama, who is very tired." A small pause. "And thank you for Mr. Volney, who gives Mama all the money for it, and who is the best man in the whole city. And please look after him because Mama says he has enough sad already." Nobody said, "Amen." There was a silence in that church of a particular kind, a held silence. And in it, Merrick watched the old woman's folded hands tighten in her lap, and watched the man with half a face look down at his plate and keep looking at it, and watched the blind man turn his face very slightly toward the small door in the north porch, as though checking it were shut. They knew. Every adult in that room knew exactly whose money it was and exactly why the street outside was black to the second story. And not one of them had ever told the child, because the child had to carry the tin down here every Thursday. And a child who knows a thing like that cannot carry anything at all. "Amen," said the old woman at last, and picked up her spoon. He did not remember standing up. He remembered the gap in the boarding and the smell of wood smoke, and then he remembered being upright in the middle of Kilbourne Row, with the rain coming down on his bare head and his hat somewhere behind him in the gutter, and no memory whatsoever of the seconds in between. He got perhaps 20 yards before his legs stopped agreeing to it. He went down on one knee in the road, and then on both, and he put the flat of his hand on the wet cobbles to keep himself off his face, and Marek Volney, who had buried his father and his brother in the same year, and had not made a sound at either graveside, knelt in a burnt street and wept like something being taken apart. It came out of him in great, ugly, heaving pulls, the kind that hurt the throat, and he could not stop them, and he did not try. He pressed his forehead down toward the stone. Water ran off his jaw. Somewhere behind him, a downpipe was pouring into a drain with a sound like applause. "Please look after him, because Mama says he has enough sad already." He was still on his knees when Emmerich reached him, which meant Emmerich had not stayed with the car, and Marek would remember later that he had never once mentioned it and never once would. "Boss, do not touch me. All right." Emmerich crouched down in the water beside him and put his forearms on his knees and looked at the far end of the street, which was the kindest thing any man had done for Marek Volney in a very long time. "I will be here when you are finished." It took a while. When it had gone out of him, he stayed there a moment longer with his eyes shut and the rain going down the back of his collar, and he made himself say it in his own head plainly, without any of the soft grammar men use on themselves. 4 years ago I gave an order about this street. I was told it was empty. I did not check. Emmerich, boss, the Kilbourne job." Emmerich was quiet. "I am not asking you to inform on anyone. I am asking you what you know." "I was not on it," Emmerich said. "I was told after, same as everyone. It was Conrad's crew, Belhaven and the Kess brothers, and 2 men I never met." He rubbed his mouth. "They said the whole terrace was condemned and cleared. Notices on the doors. Corporation had rehoused the lot of them in the spring. That is what I was told. That is what everyone was told." Merrick got up. His trousers were soaked through at the knees, and his hands were black with wet grit, and he did not care about either fact. "Drive me home," he said, "and say nothing to anyone, including Annie K. Farrow, including if she asks you directly." The study on Ardenne Hill had a wall of files that Marek had inherited along with everything else, and he had never once gone into the bottom two drawers of it, because there was nothing in them he did not already believe he understood. He went into them now with his coat still dripping on the carpet. It took him 40 minutes to find the folder, because it had been filed under the name of the insurance company rather than the name of the street, and it took him another 10 to make himself open it. The Kilbourne Bond Store had held 4 years of customs paper belonging to his father, and his father had died in the August, leaving the paper where it stood. And in the September, a man from the revenue had begun asking the sort of questions that end with old men in court and young men in prison. That was the whole of it. That was the entire reason. Merrick had been 29 years old and 6 weeks into running a thing he did not yet know how to run. And Conrad had sat across the desk from him and said, "The store is condemned. The terrace is empty. The corporation moved them out in April, and it will read as an electrical fault." And Merrick had said, "Do it." 2 words. He remembered the shape of his own mouth making them. The folder said 9 dead. It said 14 injured, of whom 4 were listed as grave. The terrace had not been cleared, because the corporation had run out of money in the spring, and had rehoused precisely 2 families out of 31, and the notices Conrad's men had seen on the doors had been notices of intent, which are a different thing entirely, and which a man who wanted to be sure would have taken 4 hours to check. Merrick had not taken 4 hours. He had taken 90 seconds. There was a second document underneath, and this was the one that changed the shape of the night. He had insisted on a fund. He remembered insisting. He remembered the argument, the one honorable stand of his entire first year, in which he had told a room of extremely irritated men that the families would be made whole, whatever it cost, and that anyone who wanted to discuss it further could discuss it outside. 40,000 had gone into a trust for the dependents of Kilbourne Row, quietly, through a solicitor's client account, and it had been left to be administered by the family member with the most time on his hands. The disbursement schedule was in Conrad's hand. Merrick knew that hand the way he knew his own. 11 names. Payments marked as made, quarterly, 4 years of them, every entry initialed, every entry perfect. Merrick read the 11 names twice. They were not remarkable names. That was somehow the worst of it. Tolliver H. Sorrell, M. Kesk, no relation. A coincidence of a common surname in a small city. Ivar Bray, age 6 at the date of the schedule, listed as dependent of Bray, T. Deceased. Somebody had written the ages in a neat column, and somebody else, later in the same hand, had ruled a line under the total and written the figure of the quarterly payment and initialed it, and had done that 16 consecutive times over 4 years without once running short of ink or nerve. Merrick had approved every one of those quarters. They had come to him on a single sheet inside a bundle of 30 other sheets, and he had signed the bundle, because a man who reads every page of everything he signs never gets out of the chair, and because the person handing him the bundle was his father's brother. He turned the page and found the covering note, "Dear Merrick, all quiet. The widows send their regards. Do not trouble yourself about it." He had read that sentence, or one like it, 16 times, and it had done exactly the job it was written to do, which was to be dull. Then he went to the household file in the top drawer, and he took out the employment record he had signed himself in the October of that year, and he laid the 2 pages side by side on the desk under the lamp. Farrow A. Widow of Farrow. P. Knight Wayman. Kilbourne Bond Store. 1 dependent. Female, aged 3 years. She had come into his house 1 month after he burned her husband. He sat down slowly in the chair. She had come into his house 1 month after. She had answered an advertisement and sat in this room and been interviewed by his own steward and had given references from a school on the North Reach, and she had taken the position. And every morning, since she had brought this man his coffee at 7, and stood in this room, while he discussed the disposal of other men, and had never once said a single word, the tin. Dear God, the tin. He knew where he had seen that shape before. The bond store had issued them, 300 of them, blue enamel with the clasps, because his father had a horror of men eating off the floor. There would be a stamp inside the lid. Volney and Sons, Bonded Stores, Kilbourne. A dead man's lunch tin, carried down to his own street every Thursday, by the daughter who had been 3 when he died, full of food bought with the money of the man who had killed him, and the child had been taught to say, "Thank you for it." Marek put both hands flat on the desk and breathed until the room stopped moving. Then he looked again at the disbursement schedule, at 4 years of quarterly payments marked Maid, and at the 11 names, and he did the last piece of arithmetic of that very long day. If those 11 people had been paid, they would not be living in a church. The back kitchen was the only warm room in the house at 2 in the morning, because Annika banked the range last thing and it held until dawn. She had the household ledger open in front of her and a cup gone cold at her elbow, and she did not look up when the door opened, because the only people who ever came through that door at that hour were men wanting bread. "There is ham in the cold press," she said, "and do not take the whole loaf, some of us have a breakfast to make, Anta." She looked up. Marek had changed his shirt but not his face, and whatever was on it made her sit back very slightly in the chair. She took him in, the gray of him, the eyes, and he watched her arrive at it in stages, and he watched her not run. Her hand went flat on the cover of the ledger, the same gesture. 18 months, he had been half hearing that book, close. "You went down?" she said. "Yes. Did she see you?" That was the first question. Not what will you do with me, not how much do you know. Did the child see you? No, Marek said. She saw nothing. She ate her supper and she caught the 5:10 back, and she is asleep over the carriage house, and she does not know I exist except as a man on a staircase. Auntie let out a breath and closed her eyes for 1 second, and it was the only crack in her that he saw all night. Then, say what you have come to say. I have come to say, I know about the fund. Ah, she nodded slowly. That is a different conversation than the one I was ready for. How long have you known it was not being paid? From the beginning, there was never anything to know. There was no letter. There was no solicitor. There was nothing. So, her voice stayed level, which he was learning was the thing she did instead of shouting. I did not know. A fund existed until 11 months ago, when Mr. Conrad came into this kitchen, looking for a bottle, and told me, being drunk, and being fond of the sound of his own generosity, that the Kilbourne widows had been very well looked after. He did not know who I was. It has never once occurred to that man to read the name of a servant. 11 months, Marek said. That is when the tin started. That is when I understood that nobody was ever coming for them. She turned the cup a quarter turn on the table. Before that, I had been giving what I could out of my own wages, which is not very much when it is split 11 ways. Afterwards, I began ordering for a house of 23 instead of a house of 12, which is theft. I am aware that it is theft. I have kept a separate account of every penny of it at the back of that ledger, because I did not intend to be caught and lie about the amount. She pushed the book across the table to him. Marek did not open it. Why did you not come to me? And, say what? For the first time, something moved under the flatness. Sir, 4 years ago you burned my husband to death in a bond store, and I have discovered that your uncle is stealing the blood money, and I would like you to look into it. Should I have said that before? The coffee or after? Yes, Marek said. You are a fool, I am aware. No. She stood up. She was not a tall woman, and she was 44 years old, and she had flour under 2 of her fingernails. You have had 1 afternoon of this. I have had 4 years. I have stood in that doorway with a tray while you decided what happens to men, and I have gone back down these stairs and put the tray away and slept in your house, and got up and done it again, and I did that 1,000 times, so do not tell me at 2 in the morning that you are aware. The range ticked in the silence. I came here to ruin you, she said. You should know that. I answered the advertisement 4 weeks after we buried what they let us bury of him, and I came up that drive, intending to find something in this house that would put you in a court or in a river, whichever came first, and I did not care which. What stopped you? You did. She said it with total contempt. You have no idea how to be hated properly. You gave me £11 a week and told your steward to see that the child had a doctor. You put £40,000 in a trust, when nobody in the world would have made you. And quarter after quarter, I watched the money not arrive, and I thought, he knows. He is letting it happen. He is exactly what I came here for. She folded her arms. And then, 11 months ago, I understood that you had never once looked at it, that you had signed it, and felt clean, and never looked. And I could not decide which of those was worse. So I stopped deciding, and I started cooking. Marek stood in his own kitchen and had nothing at all. I am going to make this right, he said. No, Anik. No. She picked up her cold cup and took it to the sink and rinsed it, with her back to him, and her hands were entirely steady. You do not get to arrive at 2 in the morning with a wet coat and make it right, because there is no right. Piet is not coming back. Tolliver is not getting his eyes. Ivar will limp when he is 60. Whatever you do now, you do for yourself so that you can sleep, and I am not interested in helping you sleep. She set the cup on the rack upside down. Get out of my kitchen, sir. I have a breakfast to make in 3 hours. He got as far as the door. The tin, he said. It was his. She did not turn round. She stood at the sink with her hands on the rim of it, and her shoulders squared, and she was quiet, for long enough that he thought. She had decided not to answer at all. He carried it for 9 years, Andy said. The dent in the lid is where he dropped it off a gantry in his first month, and would not let them replace it, because he said a new one marks you out as a man who has not been there long. She reached up and turned off the lamp above the sink, which left her in the dark with the red seam of the range behind her. She does not know it was his. She thinks it is a tin. Do not ever tell her, because the day she finds out is the day she stops being able to carry it, and those 11 people eat on Thursdays. Marek did not sleep at all. He was in the study when the grey came up, and at 6:30 Emmerich knocked, and came in without waiting, which he never did. There is a thing you should hear, Emmerich said, and there is a thing you should hear after it, and you will want the first one first. Go on. I put Ozar on the man in the flat cap. Ozar had him from the telephone box at 4:30 to a public house on Feltram Street at 6, where he sat with 2 others, and then to a yard behind the timber merchants, where he was paid. Emmerich put his hands behind his back. The yard belongs to Belhaven, who had been on the Kilbourne crew. Conrad has had a watcher on that church, Merrick said. He has had a watcher on that church for 11 months, boss. Ozar got the publican talking. The man in the cap has been drinking on Feltram every Thursday night since the spring, and he does not do anything else, because that is not a job, that is a retainer. Merrick turned that over and felt the whole shape of it come up out of the water. Conrad had known those people were alive. Conrad had always known. He had stolen 4 years of a fund for 11 dead men's families, who were not dead, and he had paid a man to sit in a doorway and confirm every week that the inconvenient survivors of his brother's nephew's worst night were still quietly starving in a ruin where nobody would ever look. And yesterday afternoon, that man had watched Marek Volney walk down Kilbourne Row in the rain and go to his knees in the road. He knows I was there, Marek said. He knew by 5 o'clock. And the second thing, Emmerich's jaw worked once. Mrs. Lasker came in early. She has been in that kitchen beside Anarchy Farrow the whole time, and she has said nothing, because she was asked not to. He looked at the carpet. Boss? The woman has been eating one meal a day since the summer. Mrs. Lasker says she takes a plate up and it comes down again untouched, more often than not, and that she sold her wedding ring in September to a man on Bell Row, and that she has been walking to the market and back, rather than take the tram, which is 5 miles, in October, at her age. Merrick looked out of the window at the wet lawn, going silver in the early light. There is more, there is. Merrick took a breath. The child is not at the parish school. She was taken off the roll in the summer because the fees went up. Anka has been teaching her at the kitchen table at 5 in the morning before the house wakes, out of books she borrows. That is why she lied to you in the corridor. The clock in the hall struck 7. Somewhere below them, a door opened and a kettle went on, and a woman who had eaten one meal a day since July began, on time and without complaint, to make breakfast for the man who had burned her husband alive.